So thank you, Vicki and Marty, for hosting and co-hosting the Zoom. I really appreciate that. I want to welcome everybody for our panel discussion on homelessness. My name's Ann Friedenheim, and I'm really happy that so many people have shown an interest in this topic. I want to thank our panelists too for taking the time to organize these presentations, meet together, and just for being here today. And this is Karen, Beck, Pooley, Sherri, Brokopp, Binder, and Roslyn, Kuba, and we'll introduce them more thoroughly in a few minutes. And there's a few housekeeping items, so please know we are recording this, and we're doing so that it can be used by the panelists at a future date. And also, we're going to make this available on the KI website. So if you want to revisit it or share it with somebody else in the future, you can. So this is being recorded. If something happens during our Zoom and we get cut off for some reason, which has happened occasionally, just go back to the original link and come back in and we'll be able to resume. Everybody's muted, and we're going to keep you muted for the presentations. However, at the end, we are going to have a Q&A period, and we're going to ask that you write your questions or comments in the chat on the side. So if any of you need a little reminder, there's a chat box at the very bottom of your screen, and you can write your questions or comments there, and we'll be reading through those at the end of the presentation. This program is sponsored by the B'rit Olam Steering Committee of Knesset Israel, and B'rit Olam means a covenant with the world. As a B'rit Olam congregation, we've made a commitment to learn more comprehensively about social justice issues and to live our Jewish values of social justice. We've set the intention to integrate the issues of social justice into daily living and the life of our congregation. And we strive to learn in a deep way, examine systems and policies, and also take action towards real change. Unstable housing and homelessness is one area that's really important for us to understand and to consider in terms of what we can do to change this condition in our society. As we're approaching the Jewish holiday of Passover, the escape from slavery in Egypt, it is an excellent time to ponder homelessness, to be without a home, to be wandering. Mentioned no fewer than 36 times through our scriptures, the Torah exhortations on the treatment of the stranger often appear with a companion explanation. Heed the stranger's treatment because you know the feelings of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We're told you must open your hand and lend the poor sufficient resources for whatever he or she needs. And this teaching must include housing. Some people believe that poverty causes homelessness, but other experts in the field hold strong that homelessness causes poverty. I'm going to paraphrase from a talk by Matthew Desmond. Life and home are so intertwined, it is almost impossible to think about one without the other. Home offers privacy and personal security. A stable home allows us to strive for self-reliance and personal expression, to seek gainful employment, do well in school, learn and grow, and enjoy individual freedom. We are told that we have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. The pursuit of happiness undeniably includes the pursuit of material well-being, minimally being able to secure the most basic needs. The decision our country has made to not provide our citizens with stable and decent places to live is responsible for the loss of capabilities, talents, and gifts gone undeveloped. Unstable housing creates more health needs and medical crises, more mental health needs, increases in suicide, impacts the education of our children, impacts the safety of neighborhoods, impacts people's connections or lack of connection to their communities. Homelessness robs us of the valuable social contributions people could make if they had secure and safe homes. When people are constantly scrambling to find shelter, moving, losing their possessions, changing addresses, reestablishing some place to live again and again, all their energy is used for trying to meet the most basic needs. Without stable housing, everything else really falls apart. And just one statistic to think about, on any given night in America, including this coming night, there are over 500,000 people homeless in our country, and about 40% of them are unsheltered. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to introduce one of our panelists. We're going to introduce all of them before the presentations, and I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Karen Beck Pooley. Dr. Karen Beck Pooley is a professor of practice of political science, where she directs the Environmental Policy Master's Program and teaches courses on city planning, community and economic development, and housing policy at Lehigh University. She also serves as a senior associate at CZB LLC, an urban planning and neighborhood revitalization consulting firm. She was the executive director of the Redevelopment Authority of the City of Allentown from 2007 to 2011, and prior to that, a deputy director for housing preservation and development and a research associate at the Institute for Children and Poverty. She currently serves on the school board for the Bethlehem Area School District and is a trustee at Northampton Community College. With all of these accomplishments and points of focus, Dr. Beck Pooley brings a passionate commitment to making our community a more equitable and just place to live for everyone. And we are looking forward to hearing your insights and knowledge in just a few minutes. And now I'm very happy to have Patricia Belden with us and her willingness to introduce Dr. Sherri Brokopp Binder. Patricia has been involved in our community and is involved with Ripple Community, Inc., where Dr. Brokopp Binder is the executive director. So thank you, Patricia. You can unmute yourself.
Hello. I was first introduced to Sherri Binder and to the Ripple community through Community Bike Works, on whose board I serve. Ripple and Bike Works are both located in the same Franklin Park neighborhood. And though we focus on different social issues, our shared interest is addressing the needs of our community in that neighborhood. Originally a program of the Ripple Church, the Ripple community was established about 6 years ago as an independent 501c3 nonprofit serving those facing housing insecurity. It offers a variety of programs and initiatives, but its most visible features are apartments offered at affordable rents and its drop-in community center for anyone in need of respite from the hardships of social isolation and/or homelessness. Sherri serves as the executive director and has so since its founding, and works tirelessly and successfully to continue Ripple's programs throughout the year, including through this year of COVID. It's interesting because she's working to help transform the lives of those in her Ripple community. And Sherri's life itself was transformed because she had prepared for an academic career. And it was when she was attending the Ripple Church and became engaged with the Ripple community's work that she completely changed her career and now is actually working as the executive director in a social services agency. And that's what I've got to offer.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce Martina Obensky, and she's going to introduce Roslyn Kuba of Family Promise. Martina has been very active as a member and leader in our KI community, and she spearheaded our congregation's current involvement with Family Promise, where Ms. Kuba is the executive director. So thank you, Martina.
Thank you. My involvement with Family Promise program was unexpected, as I just happened to be at the synagogue one day when Rabbi Seth introduced me to Jim Burns, then executive director of the program. I was intrigued with his explanation of the mission of Family Promise, that is to help at-risk families achieve sustainable independence through the work of volunteer congregations in the Lehigh Valley. One concept of Judaism is tikkun olam, to repair the world. And so I thought, what better way to do so than to act as one of a network of interfaith Lehigh Valley congregations, providing food and shelter 4 times a year to these homeless families. I worked with our board of directors to involve us at Congregation KI, and during Christmas week of 2019, we provided food and overnight accommodations at our temple for 3 really cool families. I'm therefore pleased to introduce Roslyn Kuba, now Executive Director of Family Promise of the Lehigh Valley. Roslyn was a single parent who raised 3 amazing children, Alicia, Austin, and Jeremy of blessed memory. She is also Gramsy to two of what she calls highly spirited grandchildren. Roslyn began her career working as an office manager at several local Lutheran churches in Emmaus, Lower Saucon, and Hellertown. More recently, she worked for the Community Action Committee of the Lehigh Valley, where she developed a passion for helping families experiencing homelessness. In addition, as a counselor for a transitional housing program in Easton, Roslyn was responsible for intake, needs assessment, and case management. In this role, she met with staff at the 6th Street shelter to assist with special projects, including holiday gifts, ordering for the food pantry, and creating a community garden. Roslyn came to family practice at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. She's thrilled to be part of the organization and looks forward to working with volunteer congregations now and beyond the challenges COVID has created. Today, she will speak about possible solutions to homelessness from a perspective of someone who has had innumerable encounters with assisting families in these situations. She's particularly interested in how funding is distributed and also how ongoing case management is an essential component to sustained permanent housing.
Thank you, Martina. All right, so Karen, it's all yours. I guess you'll have to screen share, right?
Yes, if it's okay.
Anything helped, let us know.
Nope, that's fine. I've got slides because they help me remember what I was going to say, and I've got some images that hopefully will be helpful. So let me do that. Thank you so much for organizing this. Just a fantastic, important conversation and policy area. Sorry, let me just make, there it is. All right. I'm going to just sort of give you a lay of the land, and then we'll get to the other two presenters who can give a more specific detail into the kinds of services getting provided. And I'm excited to hear that sort of on the ground look at homeless services here in the Lehigh Valley. To give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, just an overview of sort of who it is that grapples with homelessness, because homelessness looks different for these different groups that are going through it. So who they are, what it looks like, what the policies and programs are to respond to those situations and how they've evolved over time, because there's been a pretty dramatic shift in policies and programs to support individuals and families going through homelessness in the last maybe 15, 20 years. And then you'll see, given the way that support for homeless families has shifted and homeless individuals has shifted, you really can't talk about homelessness and not talk about housing and affordable housing and how important that is. And so to end with just a look at what a finite and under available resource, whatever the best way, most dramatic way to say not having enough affordable housing to go around, the degree to which we lack affordable housing and supports for families looking for affordable housing. So to give you an idea of who it is who experiences homelessness, there were, as you know, on any given night, as Anne was just describing, about 500,000 people experiencing homelessness. And this breaks down some of those key groups. And I've got these groups up here. This is not everybody. Obviously, those bars go up to 100%. You know, people in families is 30%. Everybody else, the rest of that bar are individuals who are not part of families. But I've got these groups up here because some of them may be surprises, as either in terms of what a big share they represent among those who experience homelessness, or what a small share they represent. So people and families is the first one that catches some people by surprise, that 30% of the people who experience homelessness are part of families, and most of those people in families are children. And thankfully, there's been much more awareness of children going through homelessness, or our students in our schools who are grappling with homelessness, than there has been in the past. Another group that we'll talk a little bit more about, chronically homeless individuals. You know, what homelessness means for individual groups looks very different. And so for some people, it's a brief period of crisis that's quickly over. For others, it extends for years. And so about 17% of those who experience homelessness are in that sort of chronic homeless category and we'll talk about the specific services and needs of that group. Veterans are up here. The incredible progress over the last 20 years has been made in reducing homelessness experienced by veterans, which is really a pretty profound failure on the part of this country as it responds to people coming back from having fought on our behalf. But that percentage is down. There's been a lot of just dedicated work in eradicating that kind of homelessness. And then, as I mentioned, we underappreciate how many children go through homelessness or experience homelessness. And so unaccompanied youth are another significant, they're a small part of the overall population experiencing homelessness, but an important part to keep in mind. This I'm putting up here, when I was there, it was the Institute for Children in Poverty. It's now Children, Poverty, and Homelessness. This was my first job out of college. The most of this organization, it's a small part of a much bigger organization. The much bigger part of the organization provides transitional shelter for homeless families. This Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness, because the organization, serves maybe about 500 families at any given time, this part of the organization makes a point in reaching out to, getting feedback from families, surveying families to find out more about the experience of family homelessness. Who is it that's grappling with family homelessness, and who is it that's, and sort of what consequences come from these episodes of homelessness that families face. And so you can see here some of the things that they've come to know after, decades of serving families, that, the causes of an episode of homeless are vast. They can relate to family dynamics, whether domestic violence, incidences of physical or mental health issues, any sort of moment of instability, whether it's brought on by a teen pregnancy or a divorce that can lead to homelessness, can relate to the neighborhood in which an individual or family has lived. It can relate to the system that is, waiting to help well or poorly that household going through that episode. So just to put up here, we got a whole bunch of different people for a whole bunch of different reasons, all experiencing, profound housing instability is sort of the one common thread running through this whole group. The other big sort of way to chunk out this group that's going through homelessness, and this was already on that graphic, but just to sort of point to it again, that a significant portion, in fact, the vast majority of people who experience homelessness experience what Dennis Culhane, who studies this through the University of Pennsylvania, long studied homelessness in Philadelphia, calls sort of crisis homelessness. That but for a job loss or conflict with a family member, divorce, incarceration, a fight with someone who's providing housing for you, this episode of homelessness would not occur. Crisis homelessness is usually short. Most who experience homelessness in the wake of a crisis don't return to homelessness once the crisis has passed. This group is significantly different from the group, more often individuals, more so than families, who are experiencing what he refers to as chronic homelessness. And this is homelessness that extends into years at a time, often repeats time and time and time again, and is related in many cases to some significant mental or substance abuse addiction challenges that these individuals are facing. And so important to know sort of how the overall homeless population breaks down, important to recognize that the issue, sort of the root cause of housing instability, looks very different for these two groups. And so because of that, policy should recognize that and respond to these two groups as they need. While the specifics look different, obviously, for those going through a crisis or for those facing chronic homelessness, what Dennis Culhane, this researcher that I mentioned, and his team have found, while it may look different in both cases, what often helps both of those groups is some type of stable housing. For those in a crisis, that housing is, the housing is the issue and housing can be the solution. For those grappling with chronic homelessness, that housing likely has to come with significant supportive services. But in both cases, housing is sort of what he considers the first and foremost part of the solution to the challenge that any individual or family is going through in either one of those groups. And this really represents the big shift over the course of the last probably about 20 years in terms of how policy gears up to respond to individuals or families going through homelessness. You can see at the top sort of the pathway. An individual who is grappling with homelessness would have moved through various efforts at addressing that by policymakers and service providers. It would have been a stepped up process that you got emergency shelter, and then you got transitional housing. And then finally, at the very end of the day, you get to move into permanent housing after along the way, supportive services have provided healthcare related support or income related support or job training support or education support. But the permanent housing is all the way at the end in that scenario. And as that graphic even shows, there are lots of points along the way where you could, fall out of this, what was considered a continuum of care. You could fall out on a lot of different spots before you ever get to permanent housing. That's since been rethought to say the process should start with the housing, get the housing. And even as Anne was describing in her introduction, the way, Matt Desmond will talk about this sort of housing is essential. It's hard to think about anything else if you don't know where you're sleeping that night. And so get in the housing. And then once in housing, that's when you see the list of various supportive services or connections to existing resources that could come after that housing has happened first. Big difference. And you can see, I love my charts and graphs. When I teach my students, hate them consistently, but I'm just going to show you them because to me, it's a helpful way to illustrate how this change has occurred. So if you go back not that long ago, 1996, over half of beds made available to individuals and families grappling with homelessness would have been in an emergency shelter. And so you see that bar in 1996, far more, but you're over 80% actually of the beds available to support individuals through or families through homelessness are going to be temporary in nature, either emergency, literally to provide a space indoors, or transitional, meant to be just a month or 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, maybe. That's where most of the resources were. By the time you get to current breakdown, over half, you can see now we're 57% of the sort of beds available to support individuals going through homelessness are in permanent housing. So big shift. Hasn't entirely shifted. We still have about a third of all beds as emergency shelters, much less transitional housing. You can see as we've tried to shift gears to move housing earlier on in the process. And there's lots of good reasons for this. Like I said, as we already suggested, from housing, you have a far easier path to any of those things that are circling around, whether it's employment, mental health, physical health, addiction recovery, education, community engagement, pretty much anything that's around that circle. And just to highlight a couple of those, there have been ample studies that show housing, stable housing, quality housing, safe housing, affordable housing has profound both physical and mental health benefits for not just the grownups in those households, but the children in those households too. Moving into stable, safe, affordable housing can have as big an impact as medication does for things like depression and hypertension. So profound, just health alone. So before you grapple with any health challenges beyond just general well-being, quality of life, housing has a profound impact on those. Housing also has a profound impact on employment. It is incredibly hard to get a job, keep a job, maintain a job, show up consistently at a job if you don't have stable housing. And so it's just a recent article, which I provided a resource list if you want to see more about what Matt Desmond is doing these days, continuing to think about this connection between housing and well-being. So employment stability goes hand in hand with housing stability. For children too, and this one actually ends up being part of employment stability down the line, but there are, again, lots of heartbreaking examples, and we saw this all the time through the Institute for Children in Poverty, the role that homelessness played in disrupting children's education. As you can imagine, whether it's unplanned moves, missing school, changing schools, all the ways in which that undercuts academic achievement. And if instead you've got stable housing, easier pathway to better educational outcomes as a child, that has, echoes in employment outcomes as, kids grow up to be adults. So significant benefits across a whole range of things when it comes to stable housing and sort of all the things that stem from that. And so the last thing, though, to leave you with is, if housing's this important, if getting immediately into permanent housing, if fixing the housing problem of homelessness is the most important first thing, then we have to talk about the amount of affordable housing and the amount of housing there is available to people, and how stable and sort of assured that housing is. One of the huge shifts in terms of housing, rental housing in particular, over the course of probably the last 50, 60 years is cost of housing. We got the amount of housing, the supply to worry about, but then we also have to worry about the cost. And one thing about the cost is that it has increasingly moved above and beyond the typical income of renters. And so if you look in 1960, about a quarter of households that were renting housing were considered cost burdened. And I've got the definition down there. Department of Housing and Urban Development considers anybody who pays over 30% of their income on housing, whether it's a mortgage or a rent. If it's over 30%, then you're considered cost burdened, because enough of your income is going towards housing that there's less left to deal with, the normal things you have to deal with in a day, but especially any emergency that pops up. Over 50% is considered extremely cost burdened. So about a quarter of renter households were cost burdened in 1960. Today, 2019, that sort of current number, that's pre-pandemic. So I'm sure as of literally right this second, this number looks much worse. About half of renters, that's 20 million households, were over that threshold, paying what HUD considers sort of too much for their housing. Which again, for not all households will this lead to homelessness, but it's for enough households, particularly those whose incomes are lower, there's that much less left over after paying for housing, that should anything go wrong, the car break down or a medical expense that wasn't expected pop up, suddenly you're at the risk of losing that housing. Here's what the supply of low cost units are. If you're in the bottom quintile of incomes, so sort of the poorest fifth of American households, caps out at about $20,000 a year. And so that group can afford rents about $600 a month before they hit that 30% threshold. And you can see that the number of units available at that level has been declining over time. This is now annual. And again, this only goes out till 2017. And none of the data gets us into the pandemic. And so that's, as we get 2020 data, in the next few months, we'll see what this is looking like now, but you can see the supply go down. The last graph I want to leave you with is the support we provide, the housing support we provide. I've got two things up here. I've got the blue bar, which you'll notice the blue line going across the bottom, basically flat. It bumps a little bit by 200,000 up over the course of this graph, but largely stays completely flat. Those are all the households, the number of households that are assisted through Department of Housing and Urban Development programs. So anybody who receives rental support or a public housing unit or is in a low-income housing tax credit financed project, anybody who's in supported, subsidized housing of any kind, that's that line. You see it's almost flat. Up top, SNAP is the food stamp program. Food stamp program is designed to increase if it is designed to reach anyone who's eligible, and you become eligible if your income falls below a certain level. And so after 2008, in the midst of the Great Recession, significant recession occurred specifically from 2008 to 2010. It took us about 5 years to actually get through it, which you see from that SNAP line, the orange line that goes way up. Incomes fell. And so the number of households who qualified for SNAP and then received support in purchasing food doubles, dramatically increases. During that stretch of time, the number of households supported in terms of affording their housing or receiving housing effectively stays the same. And so you can see too how much lower that blue line is from the orange line, only about a fifth of households who would qualify for housing support, who have incomes low enough to qualify for those programs, actually end up receiving support. So this is just to leave you with this when it comes to housing policy. We're reaching way fewer households with housing support, which is directly related to our seeing way more households on the brink of homelessness or falling into it. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll get to hear more specifics on sort of how this looks on the ground.
Thank you very, very much. My head is spinning. And I'm thinking about your number of $20,000 a year, and a person who makes $10 an hour and works full time is underneath that. And in Pennsylvania, our minimum wage is much lower than that even. So I really appreciate everything that you've shared. It's very important. And thank you. I do now want to, my head is really spinning. So now Sherri, would you please begin your presentation?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to meet you all in the way that we meet people these days over Zoom. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon and learn a little bit more about this topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts in different ways. And I really appreciated Dr. Pooley's presentation. I think it was so informative. Thank you. And what I'm going to do now essentially is kind of take some of that big picture data and zoom it down and talk about what this looks like in Allentown. So if you aren't familiar, as Patricia mentioned earlier, Ripple Community Inc. is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Allentown. If you're familiar with the former Stevens Funeral Home property on Linden and 14th Streets, that is now our property. So if you drive by there, give us a wave. We did, as a nonprofit, grow out of the work of a church called Ripple, which is actually a Mennonite faith community that's been active in Allentown for, I want to say, about 12 years, quite a while. And I usually describe Ripple Church, just by way of kind of background of kind of where we're coming from. Ripple Church, I usually describe as not your average church. So it's a congregation that is made up almost entirely of people who are currently experiencing homelessness, people who may be living with a severe mental illness, living with significant histories of trauma, addiction, abuse, etc. And Ripple Church has always done a really phenomenal job of building community among people who are otherwise tend to be a little disconnected, right? A little pushed out from day-to-day life. And so our nonprofit, Ripple Community Inc., was established in 2015, essentially to take some of that good community building work out of the walls of the church, right? Not everyone wants to be part of a faith community, and out into our neighborhoods a little bit more directly. So that's where we come from. And what I want to do today is just share a little bit about the work that we do at RCI. And I'm going to mostly just speak, and then I'll share a couple of photos at the end, if that's all right. So, all right. So what do we do at Ripple Community Inc.? We have two major programs that we run, again, as Patricia mentioned. Thank you for that introduction. The first program is the program we opened on the very first day that we received our 501c3 status, and that is our day center, which is called the Community Building Center. And that is a program that we started in response to a number of conversations that we were having with our friends and neighbors who were experiencing homelessness. And, you know, when we would have conversations with them about, you know, what are the gaps, what's missing, what do you wish Allentown had that Allentown doesn't have? The first priority that really came out of those conversations was a safe place to be during the day. So as you can imagine, Allentown's gone through a lot of changes in recent years. Virtually none of those changes have made it easier for our unsheltered friends to find safe spaces, right, where they can just be and be present and be comfortable and welcome. So we opened our Community Building Center with just a very simple goal, which was to create a safe and comfortable daytime space in the city where everyone was welcome and everyone could find a place to belong. So that program has been going now for several years. it looks a lot like it did on day one in terms of our kind of purpose and activities. It serves primarily people who are currently experiencing homelessness, although it is open to the public. So a lot of our regular community members are people who are, are housed, but may be significantly isolated or kind of dealing with social isolation for any number of a million reasons, right? That people can become isolated even if they're living in an urban space. So we have about 50 or 70, and during COVID, that number has gone up, people a day who come through our doors. So it's a busy, kind of a busy hopping place. Not surprisingly, as the COVID crisis has gone on, we've seen more and more new faces showing up, right? People who have lost their housing, people who are newly homeless, people who are homeless for the first time as a result of some of the cascading events brought on by COVID. So what we do is just really welcome everyone in. Anyone is welcome to come in, grab a cup of coffee, sit quietly by themselves, rest, right? Often people who are unsheltered can't get a decent night's sleep. And so a lot of people just need to come in and just be quiet and rest, and they're more than welcome to do that. But we also do offer all sorts of different activities and events that are really designed to help people build relationships, right? Start a conversation, get their social network a little bit strengthened. So I'm a community psychologist by training. So that's kind of the perspective that I bring to this work. But, simple activities, working on a craft project together, doing some art therapy, joining a chair yoga class. Those are things that can kind of get people talking, right? And kind of get those relationships either established or reestablished for people who have been cut off often from their families, lost their kind of traditional sources of support. So again, it's pretty simple, but we know that those are the things, those kind of safe spaces and those relationships and that community, welcoming community are things that can really be therapeutic and healing, especially for people who have experienced significant or are experiencing significant traumas. The other thing I'll just mention quickly about the community center is it also houses what we call our service hub, which is a separate space within the community center that is essentially a collaborative shared space where we invite our amazing partner organizations who provide more specialized services to provide those services at our community center. So we have, and I don't want to try to list them all because I'm going to forget someone, but you might be familiar with the street medicine team, parish nurses. There's an organization called VAST, Rally Against Sex Trafficking, the county mental health and drug and alcohol programs, ... There are more. These service providers come into our center and provide their services during our open hours, which is really a win-win-win situation because it means that our community members have easy, comfortable access to services they need. The service providers are able to access folks who can otherwise be a little bit difficult to find, and we're really finding that kind of shortening that physical distance between people and the services they need is really having some really positive outcomes. So that's great. Okay, so that's the community center. And then, today we're primarily talking about homelessness, which, as we've already discussed, has a lot to do with housing. So the second program we run is a program called the RCI Village, which is actually the only permanent community-supported affordable housing program in Allentown, which is an absolute mouthful, and I'll unpack that a little bit in a second. But if you've been in Allentown for a while, you may know that we do in the city have quite a few programs that serve people who are experiencing homelessness. We have, a number of transitional housing programs, some rapid rehousing programs, some of these different types of housing supports that Dr. Pooley mentioned. We have some emergency shelters, although we do not have a year-round emergency shelter that's open all year. But one of the things that we were really seeing in our community is that our friends would, for one of any of a million reasons, again, something would happen, they would have a crisis and they would lose their housing. And that would kind of start them into this cycle of events, right? Where they might be able to what we call couch surf for a little bit, right? So they might be able to call someone they know and say, hey, I lost my apartment. Can I sleep on your couch for a little while? And that might last until you wear out your welcome, right? Same thing with family members, right? Those sorts of things can only go on for so long. They might be able to get into one of these more temporary housing programs, a transitional or rapid rehousing program. But as we've discussed, those programs can certainly serve a purpose. They can help for a time. But unfortunately, what we kept seeing happen is that they would help while people were in the program. And the idea is that you then kind of seamlessly transition over into permanent housing. But what we saw very often is people would just fall off a cliff and they would end up right back where they started. So either unable to find permanent housing and unable to maintain that housing and whatnot. And so we we started thinking about what we could do as an organization to really disrupt that cycle. So that was sort of our goal. How do we disrupt that cycle of homelessness so that people who become homeless aren't stuck there forever? And people who are homeless, we can help them, really permanently transition back into housing. And so, as we thought about things that we as a community valued, but then also, kind of doing our homework, reading all that good research, trying to get a sense of what is effective in making sure that people can stay housed long-term. We wanted to be able to provide safe and healthy, affordable housing that would really allow people to put down roots, right, and become part of a community and stay in place and kind of become, have more stability in their housing and in their lives. And so that's basically what the RCI Village Housing Program does, and it's based on a program out of Washington, D.C. called Jubilee Housing that's been doing a really phenomenal job of this for 40-something years now. We were able to go down, steal all of their stuff, adapt it a little bit, and then kind of replicate it here in Allentown, which was great. And so, again, it's this program, like our community center, it's pretty simple, right? It's not rocket science, but it's really just focused on helping people permanently transition directly out of either homelessness or housing instability and into that permanent long-term housing. So the program itself has a few different moving parts. It starts, of course, with housing. And so we have 13 rental units that are part of our property on Linden Street, and we've recently expanded out to work with some new landlords in the area, which is great. So that's really the step one, right, is kind of getting that housing in place. Our apartments are really affordable. So our 2-bedroom apartments, just for example, are $750 a month, and that includes all the utilities. And then we have a program that allows us to even lower that down further for people for whom that's still a stretch, right? So we don't want that, income or ability to pay to be a reason initially why people aren't able to access housing. We take that housing and we wrap around it all sorts of supports and services ranging from our very individualized staff support. So one of our staff members, his job is primarily to provide one-on-one support to all of our residents, be there when they need him, help work through any challenges that come up, right? Problem solve, goal setting, all that sort of good stuff. And then again, we have this beautiful network of partners that provide other services that people often need to be successful and stay successful. And that ranges from physical and behavioral health care to addiction and recovery treatment, and lots of different things kind of along those lines. And then I think what makes our program something I'm really proud of, and I think of it as sort of our magic fairy dust, is that we take the housing, we provide those supports, but then we work really hard to make sure that our residents are part of a supportive community. So we do a lot of different things to make sure people are connected with their neighbors, connected with the Ripple community, and connected with the neighborhood that they are now permanent residents of, right? So we do, all sorts of fun things, dinners, potlucks, movie nights, you name it, just ways for people to stay, to kind of combat that evil isolation, right, which is so detrimental, and replace it with a really strong and supportive community. Okay, so the program is just a couple of years old, but we have been really amazing. It's been a great privilege, I would say, to see how it's impacted our residents' lives. You know, for a lot of times, it's the first time people have had a lease. It's the first time they've had a place of their own, the first time they've slept in a bed, right, for a long time, which can be a tricky transition in both directions. But what we've really been able to see, and I hope, you know, kind of model, is the healing nature of permanent housing, right? Kind of the transformational impacts that permanent stable housing can have, even for people whose lives have been really challenging and really tumultuous leading up to that point. So I could, you know, tell stories all day, but I think I'll just mention, you know, one of our residents came to us. She had been homeless for 3 years. And that was due to an intimate partner violence situation, a domestic violence situation. She lost her housing. Because she lost her housing, she lost her children, right? Her children were taken into foster care. And for 3 years, she was sort of, you know, kind of stuck in this cycle of trying to get things back together, right? It's really hard to put things back together once they fall apart. And so, you know, she came to us. We were able to get her into our housing program, and, you know, in talking to her and kind of understanding her goals, we took, you know, a single woman at that point and put her into a 3-bedroom apartment, because we knew the main goal that she had was to be reunified with her children. And so over the course of nearly a year, she worked with us closely. We worked with, you know, other support services in the area. And this October, she was able to get custody of her daughters back, right, which is extraordinary. They were able to have Christmas together for the first time, and it's a beautiful story about reuniting a family. We just celebrated their 1-year anniversary as part of our program, but I think the really good news for this family is that they can stay here for as long as it makes sense for them, right? And so the girls are now enrolled in the local elementary school. You know, they're going to be able to go to school regularly. They're going to be able to do all these things that were, you know, have otherwise been up in the air for many years. And so I think, you know, as Dr. Pooley was mentioning, you know, this question is not just of, you know, what do we do about homelessness, but how do we create a better supply of really deeply affordable, healthy housing, right? So that when people are in need of housing, we're able to provide it as a community. And I think it's a good exercise to think about, you know, this question of if as Allentown, right? Like the national numbers can be completely overwhelming, right? But Allentown is a city that we can kind of wrap our heads around, right? It's our community. This is an area where I think we can make an impact. And if we had enough deeply affordable permanent housing, imagine all the other changes, right, that we could bring about in our community, things that we worry about, like school transients, right, which is a huge issue in the Allentown School District. Things like intimate partner violence, things like health and healthcare costs, right? All of these map back on to our ability or inability to really provide people with safe, healthy, affordable, and permanent housing. So I don't want to keep talking for too long. I think my time is wrapping up here, but I think the work that we do at RCI is not the perfect answer for everything, right? There's no one perfect answer for everything. I think about every situation is unique, right? So the only thing universally true about people experiencing homelessness is that they don't have a place to live right now, right? And often they have other stuff going on. Often there are mental health or behavioral health challenges. Also, often there's, addiction or trauma or whatnot. I think it's important to remember that while we know those things are connected, it's not entirely clear that the causation just runs in one direction or another, right? So it's possible that having a severe mental illness can cause someone to become homeless. Also true is that being homeless is so enormously stressful, and it's beyond what we can handle as humans, that it actually triggers severe mental illness, right? So I think, we have to kind of be familiar with those relationships. It's not kind of a linear process. So I think as we think about homelessness and we think about housing, we have to think about this question of how do we kind of create enough housing for our friends who are currently experiencing homelessness, and how do we get the supports and the programs in place that can kind of make those matches and help people not just get housed, right, but stay housed well. And I think one of the things that we've learned at RCI is that a lot of the assumptions that we make about people who are homeless, or people who have lost their housing, or people who are housing unstable, we kind of make these assumptions that they need to earn the right to housing, right? And it's not something that we would necessarily say out loud, but it's something that's kind of embedded in a lot of the programs and supports that we offer. And so I think we have to really change our thinking on that, and challenge this assumption that just because someone has lost their housing in the past or is currently without housing, they need a completely different set of rules, right, when it comes to housing. I often think my partner and I moved to Allentown going on 8 years ago. We live in West Park, the West Park neighborhood. We had lived, in the same house the entire time that we've been here. And as we moved into this community, the encouragement that we received, right, was to, come in, move in, put down roots, right, become part of the community, get to know our neighbors, get involved, right, in things that are happening in the neighborhood. And no one ever has come to our door and said, Sherri, you've been here a little bit too long, right? Maybe you should think about moving on to a bigger house or a better neighborhood, or kind of getting on with your life, because we know inherently that housing is something that, when it's stable, keeps our lives functioning, right? And so no one would ever say to me, upend your housing and move, but that's what we say to people who have experienced homelessness. And so I think I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure if people are interested in finding out more about your programs too, they can go on the website and certainly speak to you or some of your other, involved people and learn more about the programs. I do need to move on. So thank you very much for that presentation. I have a lot of questions. I did write one in there already in the chat. So I would like to open the door so that Roslyn, Kuba can begin speaking. And are you ready?
I am.
Okay, thank you.
I am going to share the screen so that we can watch and see a little bit as I talk. It's always a little difficult to go last, so I'm going to try not to be too repetitive and try and pull it all together, hopefully, for everybody. So first, of course, I want to thank everyone for having me be here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I've been doing this work for a little while now, so I'm kind of an on-the-ground boots type person. I've been working in different areas. I was a case manager with Ferry Street Apartments, which is a 2-year transitional housing program under Community Action Committee of the Lehigh Valley. And that is also part of the 6th Street Shelter in Allentown. So I will go there 1 day a week. Lots of times, a lot more than that, depending on staffing situations. And now I'm the director of Family Promise of the Lehigh Valley. So I've been working with families experiencing homelessness in the Lehigh Valley for almost 15 years now. So I have a lot of experience. I've dealt with a lot of families, hands-on, really all different kinds of situations, but always families. I meet with them, I interview with them, and that's the other thing, especially with the long-term programs, it was a selective process. So I met with a lot of families determining what families we were going to accept. And I know that we've shared some statistics here, but these were just a couple that I thought were kind of a little bit eye-awakening. So for example, Pennsylvania is one of the 10 states that make up 55% of the homeless population. So it is important to realize, because you wouldn't think of that with Pennsylvania, I don't think, but we're one of the key. So it's really important that we get it under control. And as it was mentioned, 1 in 30 children experience homelessness every year in the United States. And if you think of 1 in 30 children, think about your own children and think about how many kids are in their classrooms. And they are running into people. And this is one point I would like to get across because, again, I've been in the Lehigh Valley for 15 years. I've been at the 6th Street Shelter for many years prior to coming to Family Promise. And I can tell you, we've had children, and I know you're going to not believe this, but in the Parkland School District, I've had homeless children, a homeless family from Swain School, the Hillside School. You know, the children can go on scholarship. So it really is children in your children's classrooms. And thankfully, you know, we do a pretty good job nowadays with the HUD Veto McKinley Act, where the school buses will come to the shelter and pick up the children. You know, other people do not have to know what the family is going through, but believe me, it truly is your neighbors. And I think that's really important to understand. If you take nothing away from my talk today, I hope this is something that you will take away. And it is that the root cause of homelessness in America is the lack of affordable housing to meet the needs of low-income people. And I understand, you know, you can say that people experiencing homelessness, yes, they have substance abuse. Yes, they have mental health conditions. Yes, as we talked about, maybe it's just a crisis in homelessness because they got divorced, they lost their job, there was some domestic violence. But the reality is, the root cause is there is simply not enough affordable housing in America. And that is so true right now in the Lehigh Valley. And in the course of the last 15 years, I have seen that more and more. And I think that's really important for us. So I hope you will take that along with us. And as I talked about, you know, we still have substance abuse, mental health, all these things go along with the homelessness, before homelessness, after homelessness. But the root cause is still, we need affordable housing. And we need case management to go along with it once we get them into the apartments. And I think that's important. Like Dr. Pooley was saying, you know, housing first, getting people into housing is so important, but we also have to keep that case management with it. Whether we do the case management before or after, we have to stick with that. We have to have aftercare. We have to have follow through. But most importantly, we got to get these people somewhere. And I've always believed, and it's very interesting because I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't realize they were starting to happen before I started researching to do my little talk for this. There is something underway right now, and you can look it up, where they're starting to get a coalition and they're bringing together social services and they're really looking at the medical end of it. And maybe hospitals and Medicaid and maybe some of that should start picking up some of the paying for these apartments and paying for housing. And it shouldn't just be the medical portion of it. So the Housing Alliance has the coalition started on this. It's a little political right now, unfortunately, because the way they're starting it is sort of that maybe Medicaid should be paying for some of it as opposed to the private insurance, which unfortunately automatically makes it a little political, but it's a really good avenue and something that we really need to start talking about, that maybe it is bigger than human services and partly a medical issue. So hopefully we can start getting some conversations. But definitely a great website for people to start looking into and start checking out, because I think it's kind of for the future. When I first started my position 15 years ago, really at the shelter, we really did see what I would call, as she said, crisis homelessness. We really did see it was more the people that just got the divorce, just, you know, a job, 60 days, they could save their money and they could, you know, move on. Where now we're seeing more of the increase where it's a lot longer. If you give them the 60 days, even with that, even knowing that they saved their money, they got it together, the lack of affordable housing means they can't go to the next step. And that's what we're finding at Family Promise. We currently have a family who's been in our program for 90 days. They have $5,000 saved. They're ready to move on. We have them working with a realtor. We can't find that landlord that's willing to give them that break or that apartment. And that's crazy. But that's the real reality out there right now, is there's just no place for them to go. And this isn't somebody that has mental health or substance abuse. You know, this is a family that needed a break, that needed to save some money, and they're ready to move on. So, and that should be something that I think that we can solve. So again, we go back to what I feel the root cause, not that I feel that it's been proven that's the root cause of homelessness. WFMZ reported, I believe it was back in October, November, that a 1-bedroom apartment in Allentown was going for $1,067. A 2-bedroom is $1,327. If you think about that, and you think about what they're requiring to move into an apartment, so they want first month's rent, last month's rent. Since COVID, they're requiring a 3rd month's rent. But even if you don't include that, I mean, we're talking $4,000 for a homeless family to move into an apartment. And that's crazy. When I first started, rent in Allentown was $600, $6 to $7 for a 2-bedroom. Double it, they only wanted first month's rent, $1,200. We had a family moved in. Now we have to find $4,000 for this family. And as we talked about, 2009 minimum wage was $7.25. 2021, what's minimum wage? So that affordable rent, we're back to that again. We just keep going back to that. These are just some statistics, and they kind of go along, and we did look at them, but these are more local. Basically, the Lehigh Valley rental prices, again, we see the same thing. It's just crazy. You look at what they are, over $1,000. All the apartments are starting to be over $1,000. This is based on the bedrooms. And again, if you have a child, you're getting in the 2-bedroom range. So again, these are just some solutions. I don't only want to give you the problems. So I didn't want to only talk about all the issues that we're having, but I mean, I do think there are some, solutions. We're starting to talk about coordinated approach. We have some things going on locally. We have a regional homeless advisory board. The Allentown Commission on Homelessness just began. There are some local things. I put up some websites. I just think it's important, and we do have to have a coordinated approach. We have to look at all of it. One program, the program that I administered in Easton, and there's one in Allentown, and I know transitional housing, there's not a whole lot of it, but what I ran was a long-term transitional housing, which was 2 years, and it was an education-based program. And I could talk to you for an hour on wonderful stories. I mean, talk about great stories. It was all education-based. So everybody got an education. We had families go from, they didn't have their GEDs, to one woman who had to quit her GED because of domestic violence, got job after job, but couldn't make it with her child, to went back to a community college, got her GED, went on to Northampton Community College, transferred over to Moravian College, and graduated my program, got a job as an accountant at Pricewaterhouse in Philadelphia. The people that get the education, the transitional housing, if you put education with it, they don't have recidivism. They don't go back to it, and they become citizens who then give back to the community, and they've been through it, and they're more than happy to help out. And those are lives that are changed. And then also the next generation sees the change, which is really cool. So I think, that's really a solution. But, a couple of years ago, transitional housing, about 4 years ago, was kind of going away because they were saying it takes too long. It's not a quick solution. So you have to be careful about things like that. But some other solutions, prevention, do we want to wait till the family is homeless? Do we want to wait till they're on the street? Do we want to wait till they're sleeping in their car? Or do we have money up front? When we get that phone call that says, oh, I'm going to be put out, my landlord says I owe, $1,000, I'm behind my rent, $700. Do we not help them at that point? Because it's way more cost effective to figure out a way to help that family stay in that apartment than to try and come up with $4,000 in 60 days after they stayed in a shelter for 60 days and get them into an apartment. And then the landlord gets $4,000 to put the new person into the apartment. So again, prevention is huge, diversion, all these things. People talk about tent city, tiny houses. These are all possible solutions. Permanent housing is obviously the best. We've talked about the minimum wage. Even if the person's making $15 an hour, that's $31,200 a year. We talked about the affordable rent. It's 30% of your income. That's only $780 a month. And if the two people are making minimum wage, or the one adult is making $15 an hour, that's still $780 a month. Not a whole lot of money, and nothing compared to what the rents are going for, as we talked about. So, seriously, affordable rent is just something that has to be discussed. How can we help supplement these landlords? How can we give these landlords incentives to make these rents affordable? I like to think Family Promise is a solution. So a little bit about us. We do average 4 families at a time. We try to use, the reason that Family Promise, we're a national organization. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about us, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about us. What we try to do is we try to use the resources that are already in the community. So we use the congregations that are already there. We already have buildings. We already have, most congregations have volunteers. So it's about not purchasing or getting new resources. It's about using the resources we already have. So maybe purchasing a building that's already out there that's dilapidated and redoing it. Maybe using our volunteers to clean it up. But it's about using what's already out there and getting our volunteers hands-on, mentoring, having our families mentor their families, keeping things, it's such a greater need out there than just housing first. Housing first is a great model if you put the case management piece with it. You can't just put the person in the apartment, walk away, and be done. You got to have all the pieces. So again, we use what's already available. We put the people together. And I think that's key to making Family Promise work. We do have a grant. We have aftercare. So, we say we're a 90-day program. We try to, have the family come in, we put them into the congregation setting. We try for 60 days, we have them save 50% of their income. We try to get that security deposit, first month's rent, everything they need to move forward. But we follow the family for a full year afterwards. If they run into a struggle, we meet with them, we find out what they need, and our goal is to break the cycle. So if they do run into struggle, if they lose childcare, if anything like that happens, we can talk to the landlord, we can help them out. We can make sure that they remain in that apartment for at least another year to break that cycle, to make sure they stay stably housed. And we feel that that's really key. I do have a little video that I was going to show, but I think we're going to just skip that because I really think it's important that we have time for questions and answers. And it is on our website. So what I would suggest is that you go to Family Promise's website and you can watch our little video. I'm not going to play it for you, but it's just our little mission statement. I think it's important, and you can find out a little bit about us. I will do a real quick little plug that Family Promise's annual homecoming and auction is coming up. It's our big fundraiser, and that's March 25th. And again, you can find out everything you need to know on our website, or you can contact me and I will be happy to share anything. But I think there's a lot of solutions out there. I think a lot of things have changed. But I think that the one thing that hasn't changed is there is a lot of awareness about homelessness right now. I think there are a lot of people operating on it. And I think that that's a real positive. I think like the Regional Homeless Advisory Board and things, people are coming together. So hopefully we'll just keep moving forward because, it's not going away anywhere time in the future, in the near future.
Thank you so much, Roslyn. I really appreciate you focusing also our thoughts on not just your program, but possible solutions and starting to think about that. And we are going to move into our question and answer time, but I do want to really hope that everybody spends some time really contemplating all the information that we received today and not just, leave the meeting, press the red button on our Zoom and kind of go on in our day. I hope that we'll be really thinking a lot about everything we're hearing and thinking about how we can possibly advocate for the changes. So I am going to be sending out an email to everybody, and I will include your website and Ripple Community Inc.'s website, along with other resources and materials so people can remind themselves to look and learn more about your programs. So I do want to start with the questions, and I'm going to start at the beginning. But I'm not going to start with my question because that doesn't seem right. So I'll start with the second question. I'll come back to mine if there's time. So somebody asked, why are many homeless shelters closed during the day? Can anybody speak to that?
Family Promise is not closed during the day, although our families do leave the congregations because the congregations are used during the day. So the families are bused to the day center, and the day center is open during the day. So the families can stay there at the day center, and then they move on to their jobs, or the kids move on to school. So that itself is not closed. Now the warming shelters, I can speak to that, like at the Y and stuff. They are closed because, again, the facilities are double used. So, for example, the families that are housed at night at the Y during the daytime is open. So the families need to relocate. So they close the doors to them, they leave during the day, and they come back around 7 o'clock at night. So it's basically because most of the facilities, as we said, are not year round. They're not dedicated solely to families experiencing homelessness or homeless adults, the multi-facilitated facilities. So they're being used for other things.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? Okay, no. So here's a question for whoever would like to take it. There was a New York Times opinion piece. And okay, would you please comment on a very recent opinion piece in the New York Times that proposes the creation of an agency the writers call the Social Housing Development Authority? This would be a federal agency that purchases distressed real estate, ensures it is livable, and then finances its transfer to such groups as tenant cooperatives, community land trusts, nonprofits, and public housing. So if any one of you would like to speak to that.
One case, I haven't had a chance to see the article about it, but in looking at that, one interesting thing that was done in New York City over the course of the 1980s, 1990s is what the city effectively did. It started in an era where there was pretty rampant property disinvestment. Population of New York City was declining. It was flight to the suburbs. And so you had a significant number of properties that were in tax arrears. They hadn't paid their taxes. Landlords had just left. Property owners had just left. Property's been abandoned. And what the city did effectively was say, we're going to shorten the time period. If you haven't paid your taxes, like party's over, we're going to acquire these units. And very quickly came into ownership about 100,000 housing units. And they were largely clustered in those neighborhoods that had seen this most substantial disinvestment. A lot on the Lower East Side, a lot up in Harlem, a lot in sections of northern Brooklyn. And over the course of, it was supposed to be a 10-year plan. 10-year plans are never 10-year plans. It was like a 12, 13-ish, 15-ish year plan that ran a few $1 billion over. But what they effectively did over that time was experiment in getting those 100,000 units out. In some cases, properties were demolished and rebuilt. In some cases, they were turned over to tenants associations. In some cases, they were turned over to private developers, or pretty much they experimented with all of those different things and have since set up a system by which they're going to catch properties a whole lot sooner. New York City's real estate market is a million degrees different than it was in the 1980s. But that's the first thing I think of. And that's, not even necessarily new entities. That's using the powers that city governments have and resources that states or federal government could provide them to figure out a better path or a quicker path to sort of, if anything, sort of like rapidly address, in the same way we've been talking about rapid rehousing, effectively rapidly address problematic housing. Getting it back on the tax rolls is one goal of cities, obviously, that generates more tax revenue, but get it back into use where it's desperately needed. I'll dig in, I'll check out the op-ed.
It's a very interesting article. So, okay. Now, I had asked, I was curious about what kind of programs helped bring the homeless veterans numbers down. And somebody also commented that there's a great need for the older veterans in Allentown that are homeless. So maybe we put those two, a comment and a question together about addressing the needs of older veterans and younger veterans coming back from combat who maybe, are not doing so well. I mean, and I'm curious about what did bring the numbers down for them specifically.
I don't know.
Does anybody like to field that question?
I can't remember the name of it, but I know that there was the Continuum of Care, which is part of the Regional Homeless Advisory Board, did have a concentrated effort, and there was I think Larry Copes was involved, and there was a veterans group, and it actually went out, and the goal was to end homelessness among veterans, and it was successful. And I want to say about 3 years ago, they came to the board and actually said in Lehigh Valley, they succeeded and there were no more homeless veterans. And of course that lasts, a month and then somebody becomes homeless, but they had succeeded and actually had reached the goal. But it was a very concerted effort. And basically what had happened is they had gone to the top of the list. So if they found a homeless veteran, they were able to put them in permanent housing.
And I think that was part of a broader national priority.
Right, it was a national, yes.
Of homeless veterans. So that kind of filtered down to.
Right. It was very successful though.
I do want to speak to the fact that many veterans were never really diagnosed with PTSD and ended up incarcerated in prison, and then have that burden moving forward, trying to acclimate and, build a life. Were you going to say something, Karen?
Just exactly what everyone was saying. It was absolutely an all hands on deck.
Mm-hmm.
We're no longer accepting this, and so an example of thinking about the existing partners. I mean, both the other speakers mentioned how tapping resources that exist out there, all of a sudden, if you could move some of the networks and systems that are designed for healthcare for veterans or supportive service for veterans, or get that all geared towards eradicating homelessness, it was one of those kinds of efforts.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Somebody just wanted to clarify, are the 13 rentals at Ripple Community Village considered transitional or permanent housing, and how is it determined who may live there?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So all of our apartments are permanent housing. So people who come into our program are welcome to stay for as long as it makes sense for them. So there's no expiration date on our end. And I think for some of our residents, it would be a huge success if 5 years from now they are still in that apartment and still in we're still subsidizing their rent, but they've been able to maintain housing. And for some of our residents, we fully anticipate that, maybe 2 or 3 years down the line, they will get to a point where they're ready to move on to something else, which we would obviously, they would go with our blessing to whatever that next step is. But it's permanent housing with no expiration date from our end. And in terms of how we decide who is part of the program, obviously the need is like this big, and our number of apartments is this big, which is a challenge. So what we've done is put together a committee that has a representation from our organization, the street medicine team, which I mentioned, the parish nurses, and Community Bike Works, which Patricia mentioned earlier, all organizations that work in our neighborhood. And so when we have an apartment become available, that committee gets together and we review the applicants together. I think one of the benefits of being in a smaller city is that among the 4 of us organizations, we have a pretty good, we don't know everyone who's experiencing homelessness, but we know a lot of people. And so we're able to really, kind of make those decisions based on who we think is going to be, a good fit and successful based on our, often ongoing long-term relationships with people.
Thank you. Linda, you had a question?
Okay, I just had a comment regarding the veterans program. There's a professor at Penn State, Stephanie Fredman, who works primarily on veterans and homelessness and mental illness, especially PTSD, that type of thing. She's been recognized nationally for the work that she's done, and I'm sure some of it has filtered down to this area also.
Thank you. So somebody wanted to know about home ownership. Is home ownership being considered as a workable solution?
Sure. I don't want to, if either of you want to jump in, have at it. One of the challenges is making sure you don't set a household up for failure, because there's, as anyone who's been a homeowner for like 30 seconds knows, that there are all sorts of crises awaiting you as a homeowner, and the buck stops with you. And so if there's not a budget for a burst pipe or a bum roof or whatever it is you run into, that's a challenge. The one thing that drives me crazy is that, and Allentown is a perfect example of this, in our downtown neighborhoods where you're hearing what rent levels are like, where it's almost impossible to rent anything for under $1,000. If you were to buy some of those homes, the cost of them and what your mortgage would turn out to be would be maybe $250, $300 a month. The problem is it's really hard to get a bank loan for less than $50,000 for a mortgage, which effectively takes all of those homes that would be profoundly affordable homeownership housing off the list and makes them most accessible to anyone who can show up with just buy them in cash, which then leads them down a road that doesn't necessarily provide us with the right solution for our neighborhoods or our families, certainly families we're trying to serve and support or teach in our schools, or you name it. So that is my big soapbox that drives me the craziest, that you could have someone in one of those houses paying a mortgage is $250 a month, but for the fact that we have no capacity or limited capacity, or haven't somehow, with all of our brilliance in terms of real estate finance, haven't figured out how to have a method by which someone could buy a home or borrow less than $50,000 to do it.
Wow. So that would be an area of advocacy, I imagine, is trying to look into how to change that.
And could I
Those are
just
the big guns.
Could I just add one little piece to that? Because I have a similar soapbox, which is, I think, one of the things that's really great about Allentown is that our housing is still relatively affordable, especially to buy it. But also true is that so many of the properties that are, available need more work put into them than they are worth, right? And so I think getting back to our earlier conversation about, is there room for some, I didn't read the New York Times article, but something like that, right? That can kind of help facilitate taking those properties that right now are kind of cavities, right, in the neighborhoods, but that could be enormous resources, right, for our neighborhoods, and kind of getting the pieces in place to make that change happen. And certainly nonprofit ownership can be a piece of that can really help keep a portion of that housing really, really affordable after those improvements are made.
I guess I'm thinking about Habitat for Humanity. I mean, that's just, I don't know that much about the organization on how they purchase homes, but I do know that people contribute their work equity, and you are required to have a contract of work equity in order to be a person who can have that house. So we're not, obviously we don't have somebody expert, I don't here, but that would be an interesting agency to look into, possibly to learn something about how that operates.
And if you think about it, years and years ago, I know, like my grandparents, there was a lot more of rent with the option to buy. And you don't hear of that anymore, where that will help our people, because they don't have the lump sum for the down payment. But if they could rent with the option to buy, and if that would open up in some of the homes in Allentown and in the area, but you don't hear of that anymore.
So just to make sure I'll try to get through as many of these questions as we can. Somebody was asking, does the new federal COVID relief legislation provide funding to address housing? We don't know yet.
I don't know, but one thing that has popped up and that you're likely to see more is there are more cities that are experimenting with their own rental assistance programs. I've seen them pop up in different places. Usually that's a federal program that provides support to offset some portion of qualifying households' rents. And more cities are looking at that as a way, in addition to sort of building new housing or rehabilitating housing, figuring out how to help people afford housing, sort of a task that they're taking on their own. That's one thing I have seen pop up.
Let's see. Okay. Is there
Can I just comment on that? My understanding is I have looked at it a little bit and heard that there is money there, but it's not necessarily to build the affordable housing, but there is money there to help with like the moratorium and to keep people in their current housing, and with the landlords, and rapid rehousing to help people who are homeless get the first month's rent and security deposit. So there is funding for that type of situation, but I don't think there's actually funding to, purchase the building and rehabilitate it and get more affordable housing. But there is help in there for renters or people experiencing that might need some funding, individual funding.
Thank you, Roslyn. Somebody is asking if there's any local or state funding available to subsidizing any of the new market rate rental housing in Allentown. I don't know. Bob, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Oh, you'll have to get unmuted. I'm sorry.
I'm finally unmuted. There's so much new rental housing going up in downtown Allentown at obviously at market rates. I don't know what those rates are, but they're probably quite high. And I'm wondering if there is any local funding or state funding or even federal funding that flows through to offer some subsidies for those rental properties, because they're building hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of units.
There, as far as I know, there is not, and there was a big and political issue with that. And I know, like with the NIS, and because they were trying to get like a percentage of the apartments that were being built to be low income, and it just did not pass. They could not get any low income in there. Like they wanted, a certain percentage, like 10% to be low income or to get it subsidized, and with the NIS because they weren't paying taxes. But my understanding was nothing went through that I'm aware of.
We do have to close pretty soon. I just want to make sure a few items here. So Pat said that NPR featured a story on this issue, stressed two-family homes with newly established landlords solving housing issues for another family. So that might be something to look into, is looking in NPR. I don't know which program that was exactly. Do you remember? No.
It was a long time ago. I probably could Google it and find it, but I thought it was a challenging and really interesting way of dealing with the problem.
If you find it, then I can send that along with our resource list if you have time.
Okay.
Wendy asked a question that I'm very interested in also. What are the best action steps those on this call can take or our congregation can take to help with these issues? Do any of you have, obviously getting involved in your own agencies, is a benefit, of course. But is there anything else that you could suggest regarding our advocacy for policy change or other ways that we can take action?
I'll just mention, I think there will be some opportunities locally for advocacy, especially coming out of some of the work of the Commission on Homelessness, which is in the process of developing some variety of possible strategic directions for housing. So my strong bias in that, which is not a surprise to anyone now on this call, is that we should be prioritizing efforts that help us create more safe, healthy, affordable, permanent housing. And there are other tools in that kit. But that is I think the wall that so many of our programs are hitting right now. We have a supply problem. Part of that supply problem is that we have a thriving substandard housing market in Allentown, and we need to create some alternatives so we can kind of starve out that substandard housing and replace it with housing that we think is appropriate and habitable. So I think there will be some opportunities coming up very locally to speak to some of those issues.
Anybody else? What about, Matthew Desmond is a big proponent of universal vouchers. And he suggests that if we would spend $60 billion a year, we actually could support many of the people who are struggling with finding stable housing, which is a tiny little portion of the military budget or other parts of the budget. But do you have any thoughts on that? Is that a solution you see as useful or no? Universal vouchers.
It sort of goes back to that last graph that I showed, that we currently support about 20% of the people who would qualify for housing. So who meet that income eligibility criteria and all the other criteria for those programs, we reach about 20% of them. So you can count on a housing challenge being profoundly severe for 80% of that group. And what I understand, is he's thinking about it would be so much better for our households, for our neighborhoods, for the family, you name it, if those programs work like food stamps, like the SNAP program does, that the economy turns down, we've decided we're not going to let anyone starve in the street. And so if you qualify, and now we have twice as many households that qualify, we've got twice as many households in the program, if there was space for that. That's my bias, that from that, in much the same way that we see benefits for a household once you got stable housing, that would have profoundly good effects, in my opinion, for those households, but then also you would see it in those neighborhoods, because housing instability, as we've been talking about, I love the term of thriving substandard housing sector. That's a function of having all these households who are stressed, who are sort of on the brink, even if they don't end up fully homeless, are not in stable, healthy housing. And that has severe consequences for those households, even if it doesn't translate into homelessness, but that also has consequences for the neighborhoods.
Yeah, thank you. We do have to think, deeply about these different solutions and how they actually play out. Before we end, Laura, did you want to just mention the Fund on Children and Youth? Did you want to mention that just as a supplementary piece of information?
Wait a minute. Am I unmuted?
You are now.
Okay.
Mhm.
Very kind of you, Anne. First, I just want to say to all the speakers and presenters of these wonderful agencies, just how much I appreciate, I'm sure everybody's participating today, and all the valuable information you've given us and given us to really think about, and like you said, Anne, not leave without really digesting some of this and trying to find a way to participate in some solutions. I look forward to that. I am a trustee of the Fund to Benefit Children and Youth, and we are a nonprofit organization that is there to help fund requests that cannot be met by traditional means for families where children are at risk of abuse or neglect. And certainly we are talking about families where there's homelessness and poverty. And we do honor these requests from caseworkers, counselors, school counselors, caseworkers and therapists from other agencies who can then help, represent these families and help us make sure that the money does go to meet the need that is requested. And some of the things that really interested me and learning more about homelessness and what's available in the Valley is because a big part of what we fund is money for beds and for kids to be able to sleep, then be able to go to school bright-eyed and able to have a good education. And we also provide money for a lot of necessities, family necessities, that can really lessen the burden on families that are severely strapped. And they may not be homeless, but as was said before, they are, really struggling to make ends meet. And so everything that they might need, they're not able to pay for. We're talking about clothing, we're talking about beds, bedding, we're talking about household supplies. And in many cases, we do help with rents and utilities. So I just wanted to make our presenters aware of the Fund to Benefit Children and Youth. And if there's any way that we can partner with you, I really would like to talk more about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think part of the really neat thing about today is that even these people, the people who are directors of agencies sometimes everybody's so busy taking care of their own situations and putting out fires and worrying about funding and trying to figure out how to make things stay afloat, that sometimes people don't come together and share information. So I'm really happy that we're able to do this together too. And thank you, Laura. I appreciate that.
Thank
So we're gonna wrap things up, of course. I just want to thank the presenters again. Thank you so much for your time and your passion and your commitment. And I really think we all have a lot to think about, and we want to think about how we can implement change. And I think you've been pointing us in a pretty consistent direction of permanent, stable, affordable housing. But of course, there's other things that we need, other legs under the table too sometimes. So we have to think about other options too, even if it's short-term solutions. So, all right. So thank you, everybody. If you feel like hanging on for a couple minutes, you certainly can, but I know everybody probably wants to move on in their day. So thank you.
Okay.
Bye.